Thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure to be here. Many thanks for the invitation, and thank you to all of you for participating in what I hope will be an interesting discussion. The title we have chosen together with the organizers is Whatever It Takes, How to Move Ahead in Post-Crisis Europe. But it's important to remember that this is a discussion that was meant to happen before COVID. We had planned it before that. And of course, there is the pre-COVID and the post-COVID. And what I have tried to do is taking as a point of reference the book that I will say a few words about, sort of move beyond that and sort of formulate a proposal, part of which we have worked together with Miguel Maduro and Carlos Closa at the EUI, a proposal which I will outline and which also comes reasonably close to what the Commission is currently discussing in terms of essential fiscal capacity. But let me start with the books, and because books are our journeys, and my journey, my personal journey, has two books. It has a book which I wrote in 2016, and it's basically a narrative of my time as finance minister in Greece, and it's a very personal narrative of the period, the problems, the dilemmas. And then I followed that up with a book which is more forward-looking, called Whatever It Takes Towards a Post-Crisis Europe, which was published at the end of last year. And that's the basis of my presentation. But as I said, I want to go a little bit beyond the book and formulate a proposal. But taking the book as a starting point, just one word about the book itself. The book has two parts. One is about the crisis itself and how Europe dealt with it. And it goes back, without pretending to be a historian by any means, but goes back to some of the dilemmas that we had collectively when the euro was formed. It seemed like a good idea at the time. The problems when we hit an external asymmetric shock after the US subprime crisis crossed the Atlantic, so caught in the headlights. The firefighting response with Greece, then trying to reform the institutional machinery to deal with what was increasingly seen as a systemic problem for the whole Eurozone, and where that left us in terms of a dysfunctional family. And then the book moves to the post-crisis phase, which has a number of elements, and I will try to bring them together and lead them to the proposal. Some have to do with how Europe competes in a global environment, which is very difficult. Those of you that remember Wizard of Oz, you remember Dorothy saying, "We're not in Kansas anymore." The environment as we know it post-Brexit, and here, of course, the centrifugal forces that we've seen in a number of countries, the issue of safeguarding the currency and the reform of the EMU, the institutional issues, squaring the institutional circle in the EU, the new geopolitics, and what I have called 21st century democracy. So with this as a background, let me first start by the post-crisis EU. What does that mean? As I said, the book was written and published in the pre-COVID area. And back then, and it almost seems like a century ago, there were good news and bad news. And the good news was that the EU was showing a lot of resilience. So the economies by the end of 2019 were in the 7th year of expansion. Unemployment was the lowest in 20 years. Public deficits were down. And although the work was by no means done, the EU institutional machinery had improved a lot. At the same time, there was also an existentialist angst. We were, even before the crash happened, at the end of the recovery. We had a legacy of high public and private debt levels, very wide external imbalances between countries running persistent deficits in the external account and surplus in the external account, and therefore increased divergence between countries, an inability to face a changing world. Hence, for example, the new commission coming in and declaring the two big priorities being green and digital in an attempt to catch up. and of course facing a populist push and a more general question of purpose and direction for the EU as a whole. So in the pre-COVID period, I would say that we were facing 5 challenges. The first, starting from the sort of the economic issues, completing EMU reform. And I think that the list of the 5 issues here would be the ones that most analysts would subscribe to. So completing the banking union through the European Deposit Insurance Scheme, a European safe asset that somehow manages to reconcile risk sharing with risk reduction, a central stabilization tool such as a European employment insurance, fully worked out backstop, meaning the evolution of the European stability mechanism, a real Eurozone budget, we had a proposal, not a great one, and the reform of fiscal rules. That's the first kind of broad category. The second would be competing in the new global economy. So again, the issues of artificial intelligence and digital, and the green transition, which are also the 2 big priorities of the new Commission. The third is navigating the new geopolitics. And again, here, there's a very wide range of issues, from the pure defense and security, on which I by no means claim to be remotely an expert, to more narrow economic issues such as the role of the euro as an international currency in competition with the dollar. And then a lot of governance issues around banking, finance, so global financial safety nets, taxes, digital, in short, managing the new emerging plurilateral system, which kind of is replacing the multilateral system as we know it. And here at the EUI, we have a project looking at these things. Fourth, reforming EU governance. We came out of the Eurozone crisis with a very heavy hand of intergovernmentalism, in the sense that, when you have a union of creditors and debtors, it becomes very much a power show of who holds the purse strings, and questioning ourselves about whether we move forward as with coalitions of the willing, and how do you reconcile the fact that you have increasingly diverse preferences, not just in economics, but also in other fields, and whether we should be going forward with integration by differentiation. And a final sort of block of challenges around this idea of reinventing democracy for the 21st century, issues of national and transnational democracy, and the impact of media, social networks, and disinformation in that. So I would say these would be 5 categories of challenges that the EU was facing pre-COVID. Now, fast forward a few months, we are in a completely new environment, in the sense that COVID-19 has proved to be the perfect storm. We've had a health crisis which showed the limits of where EU competence lies. The EU has been criticized for not handling the crisis, but of course the EU does not have competence in the health field. An economic recession which is rapidly showing to be far worse than that in the Eurozone crisis, and only comparable to the US Great Depression, and one from which we don't know how quick the recovery will be. Our social protection systems being under incredible strain, European solidarity being severely tested in not in the traditional kind of field around debts, but in a new field which stretches from the economy to sort of health systems. European democracy and freedoms facing new challenges, the lockdowns and the questions of monitoring and privacy having a new importance. And of course, in this turbulent environment, populist narratives finding new ammunition. It's enough to look at the numbers on polling on EU positive reaction to the EU, for example, in Italy, to get a sense of that. And the disinformation campaigns having a new space. So these perfect storms, and of course, Europe's role in global governance being questioned even more than before in an environment where we have clearly had the failure of international organizations and the traditional guarantor of the old multilateral system to deal with this crisis, the G20 having been pretty much absent, and the US, of course, much more. So basically, take all the old challenges that I tried to put under the 5 categories. They are magnified and have a new urgency in this new environment. So the next question is, in this new environment, what does this famous whatever it takes statement, what does it mean? So if you look back at 2012, when Mario Draghi walked into this board, this kind of room in London, and made an unexpected speech saying the ECB will do within its mandate whatever it takes to safeguard the integrity of the euro, these words proved to be a watershed in the Eurozone crisis. It's important to remember that this willingness to stretch the ECB mandate, one could disagree whether it's stretching it or not, was backed by member states, and it followed 2 years of reforms with backstops being put in place, new institutions, and more importantly, money on the table, big money on the table. And to my mind, it was an attitude, a very voluntaristic attitude, together with sound policies and backed up by solid institutional arrangement. And that's why it worked, because it did work. It proved to be the watershed of the crisis. So fast forward to today, what do we have in terms of, are we having a whatever it takes moment? Well, the ECB for itself has stepped up. I think that the PEP program in excess of 1 trillion has proven that the ECB is following in the same footsteps, and every new announcement that it makes kind of solidifies that commitment to safeguarding liquidity and the integrity of the Eurozone. National governments have announced extraordinary measures to deal with the pandemic on the health and economic front. A lot of them, Germany is a very good example, sort of throwing out the window old orthodoxies in terms of balanced budgets, realizing that, you know, the unlimited guarantee, for example, from Germany, being a very good example of that. The Commission having announced a number of measures from emergency support to the SURE instrument to the role of the EIB. Eurogroup having relaxed fiscal rules and allowing the ESM to relax loan rules, as it did only a few days ago. But there's still a large missing piece, and that's the central fiscal effort to convince markets on the one hand and citizens on the other, or rather citizens and markets, that the EU will do whatever it takes to get the European economy out of the crisis. And this is where one turns to a proposal. And the proposal for a recovery instrument is pretty much along the lines of the discussion that is happening at the moment. And I will, as I go through it, I will highlight some of the differences of what is being prepared with what is being proposed here. Now, in a nutshell, what is it? It's, I put it up front, the European Commission to finance member states via grants and loans by borrowing on a large scale in markets, existing and new own resources, such as a digital and a carbon tax. So in a nutshell, that's it. But how do we get there? Because we've spent a lot of time discussing various concepts of the Corona bond, of the Euro bond. So it's important, before we sort of attach names to things, to get there through a series of logical steps, because it clarifies our thinking. And first, we need to define the problem to be solved. Then we need to have a clear rationale for our intervention. Then we need to discuss the purpose, the use of funds. Where do we want this money to go? Where do we want this money to come from? So the sources of funds. How do we design the right instrument? And finally, how do we get the politics right to be able to have it adopted? So let me go through these. So first of all, the problem and the rationale. The problem is fairly clear. The GDP declines that we're seeing in 2020 depending on the country, are between 4 and 10%. And the recovery is going to be very slow. So we're going to take 2 or 3 years to get back to the level where we were before COVID. So we're talking about a huge shock to the entire Eurozone and EU economy, much more severe than what we've seen in the past. At the same time, we're seeing an extensive deterioration of fiscal positions, up to 10 percentage points of GDP. So combine those two, and it tells you that the debt levels are going to be rising very, very quickly. Now, we know that there will be huge fiscal needs to spur recovery and transformation, some of which we haven't seen yet. And here I put the words recovery and transformation at the same time, because we don't want to give up on our digital and green transition. And all this will put an incredible strain on what are uneven debt sustainability position. And here we don't have to look at the debt to GDP ratios and to point out that Greece, Italy, and some other countries are very high, but we can look at the ability to service that debt, and that's going to become increasingly hard for a number of countries. Some of them even ending up losing market access. So the problem is fairly well defined. Do we have a clear rationale for a central fiscal intervention? Well, yes, we do on a number of fronts. First of all, overcoming risks of asymmetry, such as the ones of the different debt sustainability positions. Smooth function of the euro area, if we have learned something from the Eurozone crisis, is that the integrity of the euro area rests on its weakest link. And therefore, the smooth function of the euro area requires a mechanism that takes what may be a symmetric shock, but it has asymmetric effects and deals with it. The integrity of the internal market. We have relaxed state aid rules, but this allows countries which have the fiscal space to bail out their companies. You know, Germany will give huge support to Lufthansa, the Netherlands to KLM, but that's not going to be the case for other countries. And therefore, without anything on that aspect, the integrity of the internal market will be lost. Finally, we lack here in the EU what the kind of flexibility the US has. The US manages to, because of the institutional architecture, merges in effect, in practice, the Federal Reserve, the budget, and the banking system. So if you look at what the US is doing at the moment, even if one can disagree with a lot of the specifics, it has managed to put in incredible firepower. And finally, of course, the issue of solidarity, with the use and the limits of the argument, the obvious anchoring on the treaty, but the limits in terms of how that can be a motivating force in some countries. Purpose and uses of funds, and I'm conscious of the time. How much? Well, we don't know how much. The numbers that were being discussed at the moment don't really come out of an analysis. If you wanted a real analysis, you would need to do some kind of sum of national financing needs and what is required at the EU level on top of that, and then decide how much you need to cover from a central fiscal capacity. So the numbers that we hear, 1.5 trillion, 2 trillion, are a combination of a sense of the existing needs, but also a need to convince the markets that the EU is here with a big enough bazooka. And that's fine, as long as we have a sense of matching the numbers to the needs. So use of funds, to what end? 3, to recover from COVID, to go green, to go digital. In other words, both the short-term recovery, but also the longer-term transformation of the European economy along the lines that we've been discussing. Who are the beneficiaries? Member states, to help them go to market at cheap rates. Remember, the ECB does not buy in primary markets, only buys in secondary markets. Therefore, you need something on the primary markets. Companies, and here there's a number of questions about how you do that support: liquidity, equity injections, facilitate funding, and household society at large, support via the budget, hence grants, not loans. And finally, European public goods. So investing in trans-European projects, which fits very nicely with our long-term green and digital priorities. Okay, if we know where to spend, the next important question is, how do we source this money? And here, there are 2 obvious sources, deficit financing and tax revenues. Deficit financing means you borrow on the market. and who borrows and in what terms is my next question. The revenue sources are existing sources, so current and future MFF, and new own EU resources. And here there are two that stand out. That's the carbon tax to help the green transition. We are in an environment of collapsing oil prices, and if we do not correct this, we're going to completely skew the incentives for people to remain within the oil productive paradigm. So it's a perfect time for a carbon tax. And a tax on digital activities, however we define that, which is the only activity that has increased and is bound to increase as we move forward. And of course, it should be a combination of the two, some deficit financing and some tax revenues. But as always, the devil is in the details. And I have two more slides. How does one design the right instrument? The key question is, what kind of construction would be economically, legally, and politically feasible, but also be credible to the markets? So who borrows? There are a number of options here. You can have existing EU institutions to borrow, DSM, for example. You could have member states borrowing in some kind of a special purpose vehicle. You can have a coalition of the willing, such as the 9 Euro member states that said, we will get together and we will jointly issue debt, or you can have the European Commission. To my mind, and this is, I think, where the debate is going, it should be the European Commission. Now, what is the legal base? I am not a lawyer. From what I understand, the most secure legal base is Article 122 of the treaty, which gives the Council the ability to mandate the Commission to undertake such a raising of funds in the markets, with one difficulty, which is that under 122, the European Parliament is only consulted. So we're losing here part of the democratic legitimacy, which would be important to somehow keep. Now, on what terms? And here is a very technical discussion that I will only skim over. Time, perpetuals or a longer period, a long period, 30 to 50 years. Do you leverage? Yes, you do, because leveraging is part of this kind of operations, but you can't have a smoke and mirrors situation where you just put 100 billion, then you leverage it to 2 trillion. The market's not going to believe that. Then more technical issues, is this a joint and several issue? Meaning that everyone involved will be liable, responsible for every part of the loan issue. The EU as an entity is perceived as joint and several. It isn't really. The ECB is, and therefore it will be important for the ECB to be willing to buy these bonds in the secondary market. And then the mechanics, once you have agreed on all this, which is a tall order, is the Commission borrows and lends to member states, or the Commission transfers grants to the member states through the budget. Finally, getting the politics right. We're navigating what is a difficult discussion, which is toxic, because the concept of a Eurobond is very difficult for a number of countries in the EU. Even a Corona bond, even a Corona bond by a coalition of the willing. We have managed to get to a point where the recovery fund instrument, which deals with new debt and not legacy debt, is something that in principle has been accepted, and that's a big step forward. There are questions about how it relates to the MFF. Is it integrated? Is it separate? It's not only a technical issue, it's also a political issue. So where are we now? We have taken a step-by-step approach in the sense that the national governments moved, the ECB moved, the Commission moved. Now the Eurogroup tried to move, was stopped, and now we have the Commission preparing, and I'm looking forward to hear Raffaele's position on this later in the discussion, preparing to present something which will have a lot of these elements. Now, how many of these is going to be interesting to see. So the principle has been accepted by Council. The Commission is due to present proposals. The ECB is pushing for a robust central fiscal response. It's clear to itself that it cannot pull the whole cart just through its own PEP. You have strong support from the EU South and more, and you have objections from the frugal 4 countries. And that's what we have to somehow reconcile. And my parting line here, question, is whether the ruling of the German Constitutional Court of a few days ago will actually help this process or hinder it. And I'm happy to discuss this during the conversation. I would wager that it might actually help it rather than hinder it. So I think I'm going to stop here. I've already gone over my time and look forward to the comments and discussion that will follow.
So thank you very much for inviting me to comment on the book. That was my task. And I very much enjoyed reading the book. Whatever it takes, a battle for post-crisis European Union. And I was very much impressed by the broad span in substance of what is being covered, discussed across time, but also in terms of substance, institutions, politics, policies, economics, and also law in part. At the same time, also going very much in depth in many aspects, in details of the analysis of all these topics across decades and across areas. And a very thoughtful argumentation, very differentiated. And not least, it's very pleasant to read. It's very nice to read. For me, a certain problem arose when the question was, what do I now focus on in this enormous breadth and wide scope of what has been presented in all these pages? So what I decided is then to focus on the aspect at the end, the battling aspect for the future of the European Union, the future direction of the European Union, and kind of focused on what you say, what are the two criteria for choosing the direction towards the end, where you talk about the future. And you say one is working for citizens. That would be a criteria for where to go and how to go there. And the second aspect, maximizing the EU position in the world. And then you discuss what are the instruments which are being discussed in order to get closer to the citizens when you, after criticizing, rightly so, a certain distance between citizens and the elites in the European Union. And you talk about citizens' initiatives and how they worked rather well, and also discuss the question of having more national referenda. And I totally agree with your skepticism in that respect, because if you think about, you mentioned that also in the beginning of your book, what in a kind makes the European Union tick is, given its enormous diversity, is kind of an accommodation of these differences through negotiation, consensus, and compromise. So, and as you know, now if you have a referendum, it's yes or no, it's binary. So it doesn't lend itself to discussing issues, changing your preferences during discussions and during negotiations. Therefore, in a way, it is using a lot of national referenda. I would say, go as far as to say, is like throwing a bomb into the construction of the European Union, disrupting the way it usually works in terms of common decisions. Now, if it is, then you also ask a question referring to the different scenarios which were developed by the Commission last year. You also discuss the possibilities of Big Bang ambitious institutional treaty changes in the direction of a European state, and think and come to the conclusion that it's rather unlikely, and I would agree there with you as well, because kind of totally revising the treaty, given the diversity of preferences, given the conflicts which you have been living through in the past 10 years, north-south, poor-rich, east-west, it is very unlikely that a comprehensive treaty reform in the direction of a European state would happen or would happen even across lots of years of negotiations or another European convention, for instance. So that is a rather unlikely path to go down. Then you discuss a more selective approach, which you mentioned now in your talk at the end as well, a coalition of the willing for pooling certain policies. Again, you say you find this problematic because it may question important principles and values of the European Union. And you have a point there, but if we say then, okay, the Big Bang Treaty reform is very unlikely to happen. At the same time, a selective approach is also problematic because it may undermine values. What then? What could we do then? And I think one might also think about possibilities of a more pragmatic approach of what has been suggested by several political scientists, for instance, by Kilmansegg, that in this situation of where you have very little willingness to go forward with a basic and comprehensive reform of the treaties, of the institutions, and all policies, why not go for partial projects which all serve a public good or have a joint value added of joint action of all member states, not having a selective participation, but including all members, such as, we mentioned already some in your talk as well, joint sanitary policies, fighting epidemia, joint external border control, migration, environmental policy, and not to forget also the European employment insurance plan, which has been proposed now recently also in the last months by the Commission. So a more pragmatic approach where there would be a successful political cooperation in areas of where there is a clear added value of a common action in providing public goods. I just mentioned a few, certainly not all possible ones. That could, through a successful cooperation, nurture a certain sense of European identity, would be a basis of a form of legitimation through output, kind of showing that you can do something for the citizens, which of course is based on the existing channels of input legitimation through the European Parliament and also national parliaments, and of course the national governments too. So that, I think, could be an option, a direction in which to go. I would be very skeptical to go down the road of increasing legitimation through deepening market integration through law, which is not enough because it's not really creating a motivation to consider the EU as legitimate in the view of citizens. And there has been a lot of discussion in the past years by a lot of political scientists and lawyers as well of the danger of over-constitutionalization, where a lot of decision-taking was actually taken out of the political arena because it was already in a way codified by law, and therefore little space really remaining for political decisions, for a political shaping of decisions. So that leads into directly then to the question also linked to the Constitutional Court ruling of the German Constitutional Court. My question is, and you addressed that at the very end, George, in view of the conflict now, the new conflict between the German Supreme Court, the ECB, the European Court of Justice, and the Commission. So what are the possibilities of this, whatever it takes? What can be done under this new, really dangerous constellation? Now, if I may add just a few points, which I would like to ask back to George, to his last remarks, to this proposal of this new fiscal intervention plan. When you said rather light-handedly, getting politics right. that is, of course, the hardest thing to do. I think the ideas are actually really very interesting, which you develop, and I think there is a lot of positive to say for them, and as regards the direction in which to go. But of course, the political opposition from member states, when you, for instance, said that the Commission should be in charge of issuing all these bonds and leveraging these bonds, I mean, member states would absolutely not be willing to accept that. And of course, you have to bear in mind that all of that would have to go through unanimity decision, because it's of course a treaty change. So the leveraging, you already mentioned that, of course, it has been a very problematic instrument. If it would be too much for leveraging, which is kind of creates a large distance between what is being created through structured financial products and a link to real values being there in the real economy. So thank you very much for your attention. Looking forward to your reactions.
Thanks for the floor. Thanks for the invitation to this nice event. Just a little disclaimer before I start that, okay, my intervention will not does not reflect the position of the European Commission, because I'm here under my personal capacity. And moreover, I'm not an insider at the moment since I'm on a short-term leave from the Commission. Okay, I read George's book. I think it is very impressive book, on how it encompasses and discuss all the different debates and policy issues that we have faced along this year, starting from the Greek crisis until now, until the COVID-19 crisis. My intervention will focus a bit more on the context in which the discussion on the recovery instrument is taking place, looking also at a future perspective. Because for the recovery instrument, the size of this instrument for me it's a crucial point, together with the maturity of the loans and of course of the share between grants and loans. Because the question is that we will come out from the COVID-19 crisis with a high level of public debt, and the way in which this debt will be managed at national level, but also at EU level, including the role of the recovery instrument, it will be crucial to shape the future of the EU. But let's assume for a moment, because we don't know exactly the detail, we don't know the ambition that could be achieved in this on this instrument, given also the different position and the different constraints. Let's assume that still national budget will have to play a significant role in supporting the economy and in ensuring also the debt sustainability. So let's see what are the different dimensions that are related to this managing of a high public debt. These are the recovery capacity of member states. Then there is a question on the investment capacity of member states to address these challenges, the digital transition and the green transition and climate change. And these two issues relates with future design of fiscal rules, the reform of the Stability and Growth Pact, and also to the future architecture of the EMU, including the role of the ECB will play in the future. And has been already mentioned, the way in which we'll address the different challenges will also affect political developments in the EU. Let's go a bit more in detail on the recovery capacity. Yes, here we know that if the restructuring fund will not be large enough to support the recovery and also to provide adequate investment in the medium and long term, we will have this discussion that already took place post 2013. There will be those who will advocate as soon as the output gap will shrink and will go to a bit lower, even if negative numbers, there will be the views of focusing on that sustainability and increasing the primary surplus. On the other hand, we have we will have the views of those that will call for continuing or maintaining the stimulus for a long term. For a long time, as long as the output or the previous level of output will not be reached, and as long as the unemployment will not decrease significantly, because we have to consider also that I don't think there will be a job-rich recovery, given that the most affected sectors in this crisis are labor-intensive sectors. And then also the investment capacity of member states will depend on the debt burden and on the recovery instrument. Because before 2013, already we were in a situation where, before the COVID crisis, I would say, so past 2013, we were in a situation where many economists, like for example, Blanchard, were focusing on prioritizing needed public investment over debt reduction. But this was not done because the fiscal space in the current context of instruments available at the EU level and member state level didn't allow to focusing on this needed investment. That, in my opinion, are needed also in order to improve the sustainability of public financing by upgrading the economic structure of member states and improving fiscal sustainability. These two issues, recovery and investment, will also affect the discussion of the future design of fiscal rules. Knowing that fiscal rules have to strike a balance between ensuring the counter-cyclical fiscal policy capacity, ensuring promoting investment, even at member state level, especially if the size of the recovery instrument will not be so large. But at the same time, they will need to maintain, to promote fiscal responsibility and ensure fiscal sustainability. For this reason, and the difficulties to strike this balance, trigger a discussion before the COVID-19 crisis on whether there should be the scope to renationalize the fiscal policy, partially renationalize fiscal policy, in exchange of a stronger market discipline. Now I think that this scenario, for me, that the COVID-19 crisis make this scenario not really suitable. Because apart from the fact that market discipline, strong market discipline also implies opening the possibility for some kind of debt restructuring. Now, in order to have that restructuring, even those that were more in favor of this restructuring also were arguing on the need to create an instrument that would minimize the cost, like a safe asset, and the EDs, or I would say also some higher EU budget. But the point now, in the current context, I would say that restructuring is extremely dangerous, because it would be the third crisis in a row, and because it implies a real economic cost that cannot be faced now by national economists, and also because it entails political sustainability risk. This call put into question the role of the ECB, which role the ECB can have in the future, and the question is whether, looking at the current instrument, whether ESM instrument together with the OMT program will be enough, will be suitable to tackle short-term financial instability on the sovereign debt market, causing a large increase in the borrowing costs, and so endangering debt sustainability. the way in which we manage all these challenges will influence political developments in the EU, especially a resurgence of Eurosceptical and populist movements should be avoided. But it should be avoided also, I would say, the post-2013 scenario where countries were suffering from low nominal growth, inability of undertaking needed investment, inability to respect the rules, so a discussion on always flexibility on the rules. For this reason, I think the restructuring instrument it would be crucial. I would just conclude by saying that we should keep in mind that the stronger are the investment and common instrument at EU level in order, as I said, to invest and to pursue counter-cyclical policies, the stricter can be fiscal rules at national level. In this context, also, this will help fiscal sustainability. Last point on the common expenditure that the fund should finance. I would say that, of course, this a cooperative approach between the national governments and the EU institution will be needed to move away from this narrative of enhanced surveillance, of intrusiveness, because the fund will, in any case, investment in order to be effective have to be pursued at national level. But at the same time, this implies that the monitoring phase, as well as the planning phase of the investment programs, and the monitoring of implementation and monitoring the outcome and the output in the medium term will be crucial. This requires a cooperative approach between member state and European institutions in order to enhance good quality policy making.
Starting with a very kind remarks about the book. The difficulty of a book like this is that you have an economist that tries to take a broader view. Economists are well-known imperialists in terms of other disciplines, so I knew that, and I tried to be humble in doing so. But you touch upon issues that political scientists or legal scholars know much better. But if you don't have a broader approach, I think you're missing the big parts of the picture. So that's what I try to do. Now, picking up on a number of points that were made, but some by Adrienne and some by Raffaele. The ruling of the German Constitutional Court. Again, this is the view of an economist. I totally understand the legal and broader political concerns about what this means for challenging the primacy of the ECJ and EU law, and I think that's a very dangerous precedent. My focus is going to be more on what does this mean in terms of the ECB ability to continue doing what it's doing, and in terms of an incentive or disincentive of the Council to move to a direction that it was reluctant to do so until now. And here it's interesting because as far as the ECB is concerned, I don't think it's going to have a huge impact. I think that I'm guessing that the ECB will try to pay some lip service to the questions raised by the German Constitutional Court without directly being seen to do that, because it has already said that it remains undeterred and it does not recognize the German Constitutional Court. It recognizes the ECJ. But it might find an opportunity to give some ammunition to the Bundesbank, which is the main, basically, addressee of the German Constitutional Court to answer. So I don't think it will have, certainly as far as the past is concerned and the OMT, it's not going to have any impact. But of course, the PEP goes much further than the OMT, and the legal interpretations, as far as I understand it, of the ECB push the envelope much further. For example, pretty much circumventing the capital key. And there are issues of proportionality, which I would think that the ECB will think a little bit more carefully now on a future legal challenge. It won't stop it, but it will make it think more carefully. Now, on the other side of the ledger is the question of the Council. Now, if I was sitting around that table, I would be tempted to think that, well, if we're going to, and especially if you're one of the countries that have misgivings about the central fiscal capacity, you can't have it both ways. You can't curtail the ECB and refuse the central fiscal capacity. It's just an equation that cannot be solved. So either you allow the ECB to move much further, at which point you're ignoring your own constitutional council, or you are doing what the ECB is suggesting to do, which is to pick up some of the slack through kind of central fiscal capacity. And I think we're edging in that direction. So a perverse, I think, implication of the GCC ruling may be that it will sort of soften some of the resistance in the frugal, quote unquote, countries. Now, Adrienne also put the question about the getting politics right aspect, and whether member states would accept the European Commission sort of borrowing and leveraging in the markets. Well, they have already. The EFSM back in 2010 was exactly that. Not the FSF, which was an intergovernmental instrument, but the EFSM, where the Commission borrowed on the markets, leveraging against the budget, its own resources. And I think here, politically, there's an interesting entry point. And it could also be supported by some polling that has been done by YouGov. In a number of countries that are traditionally more reluctant to sort of allow a European central capacity, direct payments into the EC seem to be more favorably seen than payments of taxes to the country, which then increases its contribution to an EC budget. Hence, we may be able to make a case for more own EU resources from existing and new sources, such as a digital tax and a carbon tax. And I think this, if we manage to make that case, that would be a huge step forward towards giving the community method more space in the fiscal sphere. Because we're now locked in a very arid argument about whether the budget is 1.05 or 1.07. And the pandemic is, in all its disastrous impact, gives an opportunity to be able to look again at this and open up a discussion which was not easy to open before. Now, a couple more points. Size, that was mentioned by Raffaele. I do think size is important, but let's remember, size is, of course, you have to be able to have enough money to fill the needs that you're identifying, but size in and of itself is important because of the symbolic aspect. Back in 2010, when the 110 first bailout of Greece was arranged, markets simply shrugged it off. It took a frantic week during which the EU countries pledged 500 billion and the IMF topped it up with another 250 to come out with a 750 billion announcement, which was credible enough for the markets to begin to pay notice. So in an environment where markets will basically condition the ability of countries to finance themselves, and therefore the cost of debt servicing, it will be very important to not go under the bar. In other words, what is everyone expecting? It should be above that, and significantly above that. And my worry is that the numbers keep creeping up in the public dialogue. So now if it's anything less than 2 trillion, people are going to say, well, that's not enough. And that's a real danger, because in terms of real needs, maybe it doesn't have to be that big. Now, two more quick points. How long do we maintain the stimulus is a really important question to which I don't have an easy answer, except to say that much longer than what most people think. Because if we step on the brakes too early, we're going to repeat the same mistakes we did in the Eurozone crisis, where even countries that had fiscal space preached austerity. I mean, countries that did not, like mine, you can make an argument, but countries that did and did have fiscal space but didn't use it, that was catastrophic for the whole union. So that's going to be the next battleground, I think, when we get there. And finally, the question of debt restructuring. Sorry, one more. Fiscal rules. Now, if you compare the two crises, it's interesting to see how quickly we threw out the window established truths this time round, right? It took like a couple of weeks for the Commission to say, okay, forget the Stability and Growth Pact, suspend it until further notice. In the worst of the Eurozone crisis, we never did that. We just ignored the fact that some countries were above it, but we never officially suspended it. In fact, we tried to toughen it up, right? So we are in a different environment here. And I think people are recognizing that we are. And it helps that people like Blanchard, for example, are arguing very forcefully for reviewing fiscal rules. And finally, the question of debt restructuring. I have to confess that I'm sitting on the fence on this one. And that's also perhaps because of my sort of personal experience of the delay in debt restructuring having been problematic for Greece. I do recognize that a wave of debt restructurings at the moment will be a third shock on the existing shocks. And there are ways to avoid the restructuring, as long as, you may call it something else, but clearly debts will no longer be sustainable for a number of countries. Greece will hit 200%, Italy will hit 160, 170. That's, well, whether it's sustainable or not, of course, depends on whether the markets think it is. So you can make it sustainable as long as you pledge credibly ways to help it, even if you don't want to go through a hardcore nominal debt haircut, which within the Eurozone, we swore that Greece was the first and last one to do so. And I'll stop here.